This is Chapter 4 of the International Relations class, Foreign Policy. And what I want to do is break this one up into two parts. The first part, I will be talking about the basics of foreign policy. And then in the second part, I will talk about the primary influences on foreign policy. And we will look at this quite a bit from the perspective of democratic states such as the United States. There's several different models of decision-making at the state level. We talked a little bit already about rational choice, where that is based on some form of a calculation of benefits to maximize your utility or your usefulness of whatever your particular goal is. And this, particularly from the realist perspective, is driven by a national self-interest. You could call this then, in a way, a national choice. So this is one thing that's driving decision-making in the international system. Another thing that is used is what is called standard operating procedures, particularly in the bureaucratic parts of government, where after many, many years, decades, whatever, of evolution of processes, that procedures are set in place that would hopefully minimize human error. Of course, got a question mark there. That may be hard to do, but standard operating procedures is another way that tries to make decision-making a little bit more efficient at the state level. Bargaining process is what states do in order to come to an agreement, whether it's trying to compromise, try to get the best deal, based on the interests of a particular agency or an administration at that particular time, or an agency's goal, such as the State Department or the Department of Treasury. The concept of bounded rationality is a way of explaining how rational choice may be used in reality. This was actually a Nobel Prize winning idea that talks about how our decision making is subject to lots of limitations, time limitations. We have limits on the amount of knowledge that we have or the information that we have at our availability, limitations of expense. So therefore, what we have to do is come up with a decision that's good enough rather than actually optimizing, maximizing utility. We try to find something that works good enough for that time. And this was termed as satisficing, which might be a combination between the words satisfy and suffice. Didn't really catch on, but the concept really goes a long way to explain how it might really work in the real world. And then with the rise of behavioral economics, we have even more understanding of what influences our decision making. And that's where we have a lot of risk and uncertainty that we have to deal with. So what we do more often than not is try to compare our options to some reference point, and if that seems to be better than what the typical would be, then that might be a good route to go. What we also see is that humans are generally risk averse. What this means is that we typically dislike losing as much as we enjoy winning, particularly if they are the same amounts. Now, golf perhaps provides an interesting example here, because a study was made amongst pro golfers where they would measure the accuracy of golfers putting, particularly if they were trying to save par or if they were trying to make a birdie. Trying to save par means you're trying to avoid that loss of a stroke. And what they found is that when all other things being equal, when pro golfers were putting to save par, they were more accurate on average than they were trying to make a birdie, which of course is gaining a stroke. So that's what you call loss averse. You try harder and you put more effort in trying to avoid that loss. Lots of examples out there, even in the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. There was a lot of loss aversion, risk aversion going on there on those decisions. Some other things that affect our decision making, particularly at the state level in our international system, this concept of ethnocentrism, which I will talk about more, particularly in the chapter on conflict. This is something that is considered a human universal in that all humans are somewhat socialized to feel that their culture that they were raised in is superior to other cultures. Or even if we might not necessarily think of it that way, we have a lack of empathy with other cultures. We're not quite as understanding of other cultures based on our limited perceptions, or the idea that ours is just generally better because that's what we're accustomed to. So that could, that even though that is a human universal, that could potentially lead to some more dysfunctional aspects. Whereas if nationalism and patriotism got a little bit too strong, then that could result in xenophobia or militarism, things like that. Confirmation bias is another thing that humans have a tendency to do. If you are loyal to a belief or you've got certain ideas and perceptions biased towards a certain ideology, then we have a tendency to cherry pick only those facts that support our beliefs. And then we conveniently ignore those facts that are counter to our belief. Another thing that we typically do as humans is what is called wishful thinking, particularly if it's a decision that we're making that's basing on our intelligence and our brilliance, whatever. We tend to overestimate a desired outcome, and that could potentially lead into short-sighted thinking or other potential problems. Another problem that states can get into as far as decision making is this concept of groupthink. This is where you have a small bunch of insiders that are somewhat isolating themselves to make the decisions for the entire country, so to speak, and they're somewhat leaving out other groups or other input for various reasons. So this comes to the point where you might reach a decision without accurately assessing all the consequences. What are some of the things that leads to groupthink? And this is the illusion of that your group is invulnerable, that you can't be hurt by this decision, or that you may have a collective faith to rationalize or moralize that your decision is the right one, and you've convinced yourself of that and continue to rationalize and convince yourself. Another thing is that you could stereotype the enemy as evil, and that results in lots of decisions. When you're thinking them as evil, then that justifies war, for one. And then loyalty to that group or loyalty to the leader of that group could also leave out other input outside that group. And then you could be led to a decision that was not really thought out because everybody was kind of already tunnel vision into the same thing. There's been several examples over the years of groupthink. Vietnam War is considered an example of groupthink. Particularly, we did have a consensus at that time that we were very much anti-communist. I think that was one thing that was uniting the country at that time. But groupthink, particularly prior to the Vietnam War, resulted in this acceptance of a domino theory, particularly amongst the group of insiders that were very anti-communist, trying to figure out how to contain communism, particularly from encroaching into South Vietnam. So there was a domino theory that said that if one country falls to communism, then another will fall, and then another, and then another, and then another. And then it turned out that that was not true at all. after Vietnam actually did fall to the communists. Very few states did. And then, in fact, Vietnam was the country that really stood up against the Khmer Rouge dictatorship that was devastating Cambodia. The Iraq War is considered another example of groupthink in that there was a small bunch of insiders within the administration there that pretty much shunned all of the input that could have come in from the intelligence agencies. They literally had their own intelligence gathering unit and kind of shut out the CIA to a certain extent, because in this case, they pretty much had rationalized already that this was going to happen. So then they had to come up with ways to figure out how to sell the war. Now, obviously, there was positives and negatives that came up out of the Iraq War. We'll probably talk about that a little bit more, but it's certainly a mixed bag, and it was certainly more expensive and more destructive than what was expected. Then there's a lot of question marks as to what it actually accomplished. So clearly, when you look at how the decision was made to go to the Iraq War, it comes up to be a pretty good example of groupthink. So let's talk about the general goals of foreign policy, kind of breaking them down into three major parts here. One, of course, is to provide national security. We have sovereign states that were pursuing our own ideas of whether or not it's national interest or international cooperation, whatever that may be. So we have to protect ourselves from foreign threats or disruptions of any form of supplies that we rely on, such as energy supplies, oil. One of the things that one of our goals of national security over the years was to wean ourselves off of foreign oil so that we wouldn't be as reliant. Another thing is to promote the economy. Now, I have international economy here, and this could vary between administrations. For example, the administration that we have right now is pulling back away from the international economy and pursuing more of a nationalist-leaning economy. But then that, of course, influences foreign policy, that we would perhaps put in more tariffs or trade embargoes, things like that. But regardless of whether you're leaning nationalist or leaning internationalist in your view of the global economy, decisions have to be made as far as trade. What products do we want to trade? What do we want to do as far as tariffs? How much do we want to delegate to the World Trade Organization, for example, to referee that? Foreign investment, the multinational corporations of any country are responsible for foreign investment, and governments rely on that foreign investment. Even the United States looks for foreign investment from other countries, but the poor countries most definitely need investment from multinational corporations from particularly the rich countries. And then what are we going to do as far as protecting perhaps our domestic industries? That's protectionism is something that we'll get into in a lot more detail later on, but these are all aspects of the international/national economy that affect our foreign policy. And another thing that is a goal of foreign policy is to maintain the international institutions that have been set up, particularly since the end of World War II, when the major powers got together and said, let's create a framework that's going to try to prevent this from ever happening again. And it's been relatively successful when you look at it that way, despite the fact that we got right into a Cold War, and despite the fact that we've got lots of conflict within countries around the world. But maintaining these international institutions is something that has been a very long-standing norm in our system in order to delegate certain things to these IOs that it's more practical and more efficient for them to handle it kind of as a global problem rather than each state pursuing that on their own, which could be many times more expensive. I'll even give you an example on that later on of how that works. But the global issues of human rights, the environment, peacekeeping, and the health and disease issues that we're dealing with right now, those are global issues that states delegating those to international institutions is a more efficient way of trying to address those. And so therefore, these international institutions need to be maintained. We'll look particularly at U.S. foreign policy here, that's the perspective that we're coming from. In any democratic society, the president typically is the originator or the initiator of foreign policy, and that's per the Constitution. The president is the only office in America that's elected or voted on by all of the people in the United States. So the president represents to the rest of the world. So therefore, it kind of makes a little bit more sense that the president would be the face of the nation and therefore the representative of the nation and therefore the initiator of foreign policy. And the Constitution also says that the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and that's a very big, powerful responsibility, particularly in America, when you see that our military is so many more times bigger than any other country's military. The president has to have a certain amount of flexibility and adaptability to use that military where they see fit. Now, we'll talk about some of the problems with that here in a few minutes, but that is Constitution, that the president is in charge of the military. We have a civilian control of the military, so the president has to have some power and decision-making with respect to that right off the bat. The president is also tasked with negotiating treaties according to the Constitution. Now, the president may not necessarily go out there and do the negotiating him or herself, but his delegate does, or Secretary of State, the State Department and the diplomats will be part of that, any particular envoys that could be appointed to go negotiate those treaties. And then the president ultimately signs those treaties, but not ratified yet because, according to the Constitution, has to come back to the Senate, and it has to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate for that treaty to be in effect. And because of the fact that the Senate is very polarized and it's extremely difficult to get any treaties approved, well, we've kind of shifted from this concept of international treaties more into what we call executive agreements, and this has given the president even more power. So we'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. But negotiating treaties is the president's job according to the Constitution. And the president also is tasked with appointing all of the department heads of all the agencies that have anything to do with foreign policy, as well as all the ambassadors to all the countries in the world that have a U.S. consulate there. The president is responsible for appointing all of those people, and the Senate also has to approve these appointments by a majority vote. So there's part of those checks and balances that we've mentioned before. But the president, of course, is the initiator of all of this, and therefore foreign policy originates with the president. The president has extraordinary amount of power with respect to foreign policy, and that's one of the reasons why I implore all of my classes every year, every semester. I say, you want to pay attention to who's running for president. That matters. It really does matter, particularly with foreign policy, because of how much freedom that the president has to initiate foreign policy, and then those decisions are done that you may have to deal with the consequences even before Congress deals with it. So it matters that you want to get to know how that person thinks, what makes them tick, how do they view the rest of the world, how do they view America's place in the world. And that all that is important as far as who gets put into that particular office because of how much power they have on foreign policy. Now that we've said that, the president has actually, not this particular president, but any president of the United States for the last several decades has picked up more powers. So what we're going to talk here for the next few minutes is the expanded powers of the president, and a lot of this pertains to their constitutional authority on foreign policy. But these powers have expanded beyond what the original framers of the Constitution might have intended. One of the things, we'll talk about three things. We'll talk about blanket resolutions where Congress gives the president the authorization to use military force, and that could potentially evolve into war. We've seen lots of examples of that. Another one is what we just alluded to, was the executive agreements. We'll get into that one in a minute. And then the expanded use of executive orders. This has been a very much researched part of political science for several decades, is how that one person has been given more and more and more power over the years because of these things that have evolved that have been generally accepted. First one, blanket resolutions. Congress is the only way that we can declare war on another country is Congress has to declare that. That's another part of these separations of powers. Just like the Congress makes a law and then they pass it over to the president to execute that law. Well, the same thing happens here. Congress has the power to declare war, and then they pass that over to the president, who is commander-in-chief, to execute that war. Separation of powers. However, in today's world, it's becoming less and less likely that Congress will ever declare war against anyone. The last time Congress actually did declare war was World War II. So look at what's happened since then, and then you'd have to ask yourself, well, then how did that happen? Well, what Congress does instead is give the president essentially a blank check that says, okay, there's a problem over there in another country or another region, and we want to give you an authorization. These are sometimes most recently called authorization to use military force, AUMF. So, Mr. President, take care of that problem. And oftentimes the language in those authorizations actually says this: by any means necessary, take care of that problem. You have authorization to use military force to take care of that problem. And what we have seen is that these have most often escalated into a full war that was never declared. So that's how the expanded powers of the president have really made a difference. There's consequences to this particular expanded power here because of the amount of conflict that we've been in that wasn't declared, even though it escalated into a full war. Several examples going all the way back to, you could even argue perhaps the Korean War. However, Truman did go through the United Nations in order to get that war going, even though there's no question the United States was the driver of that war. But moving ahead, we see that Vietnam, even in the 50s, there was a lot of attention on Vietnam, that once they got out from under France, then they might eventually, particularly South Vietnam, may go communist. So in 1964, there was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin to where the ship felt like that one, perhaps two torpedoes had been fired upon them. It was never confirmed. Nevertheless, President Johnson, this was an election year, and he was running against Barry Goldwater, the Republican, who was very hawkish, he'd even proposed, perhaps off the record, to drop an atomic bomb on Vietnam to resolve that issue. So Johnson was competing against that. Not only that, both parties were very much on the same page as far as anti-communism and communism containment. And then, of course, the domino theory latched on. Johnson used this incident to go to Congress and say, okay, look what's going on here. I need authorization to take care of this problem. And look how the Congress kind of fell in line. The vote in the House to authorize President Johnson to take care of that problem in Vietnam, called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, 416-0 in the House, 88-2 in the Senate. Overwhelming support, and yet within 3 years, that war was literally out of control. We were approaching 58,000 deaths of American soldiers, average age 19 years old of those dead soldiers. And then by early 1968, it had gotten so bad that President Johnson said that he's not even going to run for re-election. So that shows you how potentially good intentions and overwhelming support can turn on you pretty dramatically. The Gulf War resolution, interestingly enough, had more opposition to it, but yet turned out a little better. So it's hard to predict any of these things. Because of the fact that Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, oil was obviously at the top of the issues here, but also violating Kuwait's sovereignty was a very, as I've said before, sovereignty is probably the only hard and fast rule that all the states can agree with in our international system. And Saddam Hussein clearly, violently had violated Kuwait's sovereignty. So therefore, it wasn't just the United States. It was a pretty strong coalition that included, at that time, the Soviet Union that was about to break up, or may have just broken up. So they were our ally on this, even though because of the motivations around other ulterior motives as to why we might be doing this, it was considerably more contentious as far as approving that Gulf War resolution in the Congress, as you can see with the votes right there. However, that conflict was relatively short-lived with very, very minor casualties on the United States' part, and we did push Saddam Hussein back into his borders of Iraq. Now, what happened 10 years later is another story. But now we come forward to the 9/11, and then within a couple of weeks after 9/11, there was overwhelming support to take care of this terror problem. War on Terror resolution, as you can see, overwhelming support for President George W. Bush to take care of that terrorist problem. And we see that we gotten into two wars as a result, neither of which were satisfying to any degree, despite perhaps some benefits had been gained. But again, a lot of mixed results there. But this is just an example how the president's power has expanded to where the Congress gives him authorization to take care of this problem, but yet it morphs into full-scale war that becomes very expensive and destructive and does not necessarily solve anything. As we'll see later on, it pretty much destroyed George W. Bush's administration. The Iraq War resolution, quite contentious, even though the United States was still very united post 9/11 in the war on terror. And this is one of the groupthink concepts that I talked about earlier, where the Bush administration had pretty much made up their mind that they were going to go back in and get rid of Saddam Hussein. And there was quite a bit of support on that, 70% support on that when it started, but then that evolved into a major war that was going badly as it went, and then the public opinion flip-flopped completely around on that within 3 years. These are examples of what we call the blanket resolution, or authorization to use military force, an expanded power of the president that does not appear to have been intended by the framers of the Constitution. Another expanded power that we've already touched on is the executive agreements that are not approved by the Senate. Because of our contentious, polarized two-party politics, the Senate has considerable difficulty approving a two-thirds vote of anything. So therefore, global treaties have pretty much become non-existent. We can go all the way back to the Kyoto Protocol in 97 that President Clinton signed, but it was not ratified by a Republican-leaning Senate. And even if Republicans had not been in control of the Senate, it would have been very difficult to get two-thirds vote on that. International Criminal Court was another treaty that was pursued in 2003. In that case, George W. Bush did not even submit it to the Senate because he knew that it would not get approved. And even the Paris Accords, that was, you could certainly argue that would be a global treaty, and it was not even considered to be submitted to the Senate, and it was considered more of an executive agreement, even though it was probably more appropriate as a global treaty. So because of this very strong difficulty of having global treaties approved by the Senate, what the president has evolved the power to do is what we call these executive agreements that have the same effect of treaties. And what they are is more like international compacts with a country or a group of countries, not a global treaty. And this eliminates the potential of the never-ending approval process where it may never get approved, and therefore the president's credibility is undermined when that happened. You go all the way back. One of the first biggest examples of this was when Woodrow Wilson, at the end of World War I, was the initiator of the League of Nations. It was technically his idea, and he went over to Europe to negotiate the treaty for the League of Nations, and he brought it back, and the Senate rejected it. So Truman's credibility was tarnished because the European states that had been depending on the United States involvement of that said, what? Yeah, it was your idea, and you can't even get your own Senate to approve it. And so therefore, the United States leaned more isolationist, and Europe was really not effective in preventing World War II. Again, hard to predict what would have occurred otherwise, but it's just an example of how the president's credibility of the promise that he made was undermined. And under the Roosevelt administration, he made some agreements with the Soviet Union in the run-up to the World War II. This was before we were even thinking about getting involved, but Roosevelt was working to help our potential allies there. That particular case where he expropriated some property from a Russian-owned company went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the president and said, as commander-in-chief, as the initiator of foreign policy, the president has to be able to make these agreements as he sees fit in his role. So that set the precedent for the president to make these agreements, and they have evolved over time to where almost all international agreements are now these executive agreements instead of treaties. The only treaties that the United States has actually, or the Senate has actually approved in the last 10 years are a few extradition treaties with a couple of South American countries. And those are pretty much no-brainers. You know, if you want an extradition treaty with a country, that's not that big a deal. So the Senate will approve that. Otherwise, we're going in another direction, and as a result, giving the president even more power in the area of foreign policy. The third that we'll talk about is executive orders. These have really evolved dramatically since the modern era after World War II, but they have also, in a polarized system, have become more of a way of president making legislation, which is Congress's job. So that's another thing that we're giving more power for the president to do, to make legislative decisions when in fact Congress is the one tasked to do that. But what an executive order typically is doing is making a rule that the executive branch must follow. But it does have formal status of legislation as long as it does not violate a law set by Congress or the Constitution. It typically has to do with some procedural element of the bureaucracy, some organizational aspects of it having to do with perhaps revising the structure or personnel. Been lots of examples of executive orders where President Obama had raised the minimum wage of all government contractors. So what that means is that anybody that's dealing with the administration could also be affected by this executive order, so it could have far-ranging consequences. A lot of these executive orders have to do with sanctions on other countries, which is why it is so important to talk about here in the chapter on foreign policy. Some examples, there's dozens of them. You can go to the archives. I'll show you the website here in a minute. But in 1976, an executive order, Gerald Ford banned political assassinations. Now, you could say that they were not allowed by law. Nevertheless, once the reports came out that the CIA had been involved in several coups as well as assassination attempts, and some of them successful, Ford said that, well, we're not going to go there. So he banned political assassinations. As a rule, that's not the way to go. I mean, particularly When we look at the war on terror, the CIA got involved in rendition, waterboarding, things like that, going all out to try to get information from suspected terrorists. And then once all that came out, they got reined back in. And we all pretty much agreed that says, well, terrorism or not, that's not the way we want to go. That's not the way we want to do it. So these things are always evolving, retracting. Carter was having to deal with the Iranian hostage crisis, and so one of the things that he did was to freeze Iranian assets to try to incite the kidnappers, particularly the new regime, the Ayatollah. Ayatollah would want access to all those assets, though therefore perhaps trying to entice them to deal on giving up the hostages. That didn't work. That hostage crisis was very harmful to Carter's administration. One of the reasons why, not the only one, but one of the reasons, part of the ingredients there is why he did not get reelected. And then George Bush II established the Office of Homeland Security as an executive order. So post 9/11, there was a restructuring of the government to create a new department that would guard against terrorist threats on our homeland. So they brought in agencies from other groups, created a couple of agencies, but they realized fairly quickly that if it was an Office of Homeland Security, now office means it's part of the executive office of the president, which is basically his advisor. Once they determined that this Office of Homeland Security would really not have the clout that it really needs in order to take care of this Homeland Security, well, then Congress then passed a law that established the Department of Homeland Security, which is one of our 15 cabinet departments. But however, it was first established through an executive order. Looking at the number of executive orders, but with two-term presidents, so you can see the numbers there. Obama was a little bit lower than the norm here, but as you can see, Harry Truman was quite prolific in his executive orders because post-World War II, we were kind of establishing a new world, and Truman pretty much restructured the entire Defense Department through executive orders. One of his executive orders actually created what is now the CIA. So very prolific post-World War II. And then with President Trump, he promised a lot of executive orders because of the gridlock that we have in our Congress. He had 55 in the first year. He has 182 at present as far as executive orders. But despite the number of executive orders, what the executive orders is doing is been giving the president more power to establish legislative type acts. Even the Dreamers Act, when Obama was trying to get Congress to come up with some immigration reform and never got anything, through an executive order, he tasked the Homeland Security not to go after children of illegal immigrants. So therefore creating the Dreamers program to where then they could come forward to establish citizenship and get legal, because the Homeland Security was tasked, this is what you call prosecutorial discretion, an executive order. Then the other party then went after that and said, well, that's unconstitutional, you can't do that. So the Congress is tasked with making these laws, and when presidents do these executive orders, well, then the next president come in and just undo it, and then do their own executive orders and literally establish their own form of legislation while they're in office because of the inactivity of Congress. So you can see how complicated it's potentially getting to be, and not intended by the framers who wrote the Constitution. And we're heaping a lot more power, a lot of it symbolic, on this one person. And we'll talk about that more in part 2 when we get into the influences on foreign policy.